So good afternoon. Thank you for being here, Matthias. Matthias Duwe is the head of climate at Ecologic Institute in Germany. Prior to that, he studied at SOAS University. He was director of Climate Action Network in Brussels. It's a pleasure to have you here. You've participated this afternoon in a roundtable celebrated by Elcano Royal Institute, in which we discussed the results of COP23. We also talked about the science and how that has an influence in how we make policy. And you presented your latest report on long-term climate law at national and subnational level, and I wanted to ask you whether you'd be so kind as to run us through the key messages of your report.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Lara, for having me. So we looked at 13 case studies from around the globe, with the majority of them being in Europe. And I think one of the key messages that comes out is there's quite a lot of momentum behind governments developing these long-term climate policy frameworks in the spirit and inspired by the Paris Agreement. A number of them are from just the last couple of years. There are 3 in Europe alone this year. And then in the Netherlands, there's been a recent political decision to develop a national climate law. Now Spain is considering one also. So we see that those countries in particular that are wanting to implement the Paris Agreement in a credible fashion and take the long-term dimension of it seriously, they move towards these long-term climate laws. And actually making them a law and not just a non-binding framework is also something that we find makes a difference. And there's also an increasing momentum behind actually adopting laws and not going for non-binding frameworks. And having a law lends you a lot of additional credibility, also clarity in the procedures, and gives you stability across electoral cycles, for example. And then there are a lot of innovations in the way that the processes are designed to make sure that they actually capture this challenge of starting from where we are right now, setting a goal that's very much decades into the future, and trying to help give politicians and stakeholders a way of making sure that we're actually moving along the path towards that long-term goal. And those include actually enshrining also that long-term goal in the legal framework, to make sure that that's really clearly established as the direction that we're working towards. And then a number of countries have chosen to put increments in between, not just milestones every 10 years, but more 5-year and even annual so-called carbon budgets that give you a more precise quantity of emissions for a certain period. And these are usually set 10, 12 years in advance. So already this is looking beyond normal electoral cycles, but it's giving a constant flexibility of adapting towards the long-term goal. And I think that's one of the strong best practice mechanisms that we see.
Mm-hmm. And I was wondering whether, aside from carbon budgets, you could perhaps comment on experiences such as the carbon price floors, and how that perhaps has helped countries such as the UK to have a high price for internalising the externality of greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. A couple of countries that have adopted these long-term climate laws have actually mentioned specific policies in them, but not necessarily a lot. It's the exemption from the rule. A lot of these are generally frameworks, putting the procedures in place, but there are a couple of notable exceptions. And if I may pick up on the example of France first, where there's actually a carbon tax with very specific levels of carbon prices that's been set in the law specifically, as a means of actually giving that the weight of being enshrined in law, and sending a clear signal that is the way that policy is going to develop. So rather than just focusing on procedural things, I think adding also some content specifics, some policy specifics, I think is another example of a best practice case. And then specifically, this carbon tax can act a little bit as a carbon price floor. In Europe, we do have the issue that our flagship instrument for the EU as a whole, the EU emissions trading system, has suffered from an oversupply of allowances, and therefore the price has been under quite some downward pressure. And the UK, I believe, was the first country to install a carbon price floor, and this has also been under discussion in several other countries as a way of propping up the price. And arguably, one could install that kind of carbon price floor with an escalator in also a national legal framework for climate policy.
So carbon budgets, carbon price floors. I'm wondering whether there are any other elements that you see commonly across perhaps national or also subnational levels that could inform perhaps regards engagement with different stakeholders.
Absolutely, there are a number of features that appear on several occasions and that seem to contribute to the strength and stability of the systems. One has to keep in mind that a number of the ones that we looked at are relatively recent, so they haven't been able to prove themselves significantly over longer periods of time. But we have both those that have been in place for almost 10 years and those that are very recent, and they contain the same type of features. One that I'd like to highlight is a lot of the systems establish independent expert advisory councils as a means of helping the government stay accountable and lending credibility and a neutrality of analysis to important functions such as monitoring whether a country is actually on track, making progress towards its target, but also providing a fact-based background for taking decisions, for example, on policy development or on reviewing targets, such as these carbon budgets that I mentioned earlier. They are analyzed and being given scientific background analysis on by, in the UK Climate Change Committee, for example. And another highlight from the case studies that features in almost all of them is certainly the engagement with stakeholders. And I think that's quite key, because despite the fact that you have legal frameworks and they can be less easily challenged than having a non-binding framework, you still need a lot of political support, not just for the adoption of such a law, but also for the implementation. And so getting stakeholders on board, both, say, from the political spectrum, so actual politicians, parliamentarians, involving them across parties and gaining their buy-in and having them have a stake in this issue, in the law and its adoption, can be of great use for future implementation, but also the various constituencies from companies, environmental groups, trade unions, etc. Involving them both in development and then in some kind of implementation oversight will create ownership and help the law come to life in a meaningful fashion.
Great, and perhaps the most difficult question, we've talked about engagement by stakeholders, but we haven't talked about climate policy integration or mainstreaming across government departments, and I was wondering whether you have any ideas as to how that has been done in other jurisdictions that can inform the Spanish debate, for example.
Right, I think that's a very important point. First of all, in terms of the institutional setup, so you will want to have both involvement of a lot of ministries, but at the same time you want a sense of hierarchy in terms of somebody actually being in charge and being reported to and being in the driver's seat. And we have several examples in Mexico, for example, to pick one. The law has given the Environment Ministry, Semanat, a clear lead role and makes the other ministries answer to their requests. So they come as a clear demandeur because the law has given them that role, and they don't come in a more of a begging for policy inputs type of position. So clarity of the institutional setup, but also making sure that all of the sectors need to be involved. Your point on mainstreaming is something that you can clarify in the institutional setup. And then there are specific examples from Europe. I'll take Sweden, which specifically has a line in the law that says that climate policies and their budgetary policies need to be aligned with one another. And so these laws provide an opportunity for governments to have certain policy areas come together, and for climate policy not just be in its own little silo, but actually be mainstreamed across governments. And with these relatively simple lines, at least creating an obligation for government to consider mainstreaming climate policy elsewhere as an obligation rather than just a statement of intent.
Well, thank you ever so much. That was really interesting, and we hope to keep on reading your reports very soon. Do you want to tell us where we can find your report?
Absolutely. So the report is available on ecologic.eu, our website, and you'll find a whole range of additional publications also on long-term strategies, on ways to evaluate them, and on experience in Europe with putting such strategies together.
Thank you very much, Matthias.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.